Welcome, you restless souls, to another late-night deep dive here on Beyond Midnight. You've probably stumbled upon us because the usual sanitized versions of history just aren't quite cutting it for your particular brand of nocturnal contemplation. And frankly, who can blame you? Tonight, we're peeling back the layers of a historical period that has been, shall we say, aggressively remarketed over the centuries. We're talking about the Vikings. Yes, those Vikings. Not the chaps with the artisanal beard sipping craft meet at your local historical reenactment fair, or the brooding, morally ambiguous antiheroes on your streaming service of choice. No, we're going to talk about the actual Vikings. The ones who, if they showed up on your doorstep, you wouldn't be asking for a selfie. You'd be asking for a miracle and probably not getting one. Our subject tonight, and for a good long while, is the brutal reality of Viking raids. And trust me, the emphasis here is very much on the brutal and the reality. For too long, we've been fed a rather palatable, almost romanticized narrative of these Norse seafarers. They were explorers, weren't they? Bold adventurers, master shipbuilders, even early democrats in their own peculiar, axe-wielding way. And yes, they were all of those things. But they were also, unequivocally, terrifyingly, and ruthlessly a force of destruction. Imagine, if you will, waking up one perfectly ordinary Tuesday morning, perhaps tending to your sheep, or diligently illuminating a manuscript, or simply trying to brew a decent batch of ale, when suddenly, out of the morning mist, sleek, menacing longships emerge from the sea. Not one or two, but dozens. And they're not here to trade furs or discuss the finer points of Norse poetry. They are here for your stuff, all of it, and possibly your life, and definitely your freedom. And maybe your soul, if they can figure out how to package it. This wasn't some isolated incident, mind you. This was a sustained, often relentless campaign of terror that reshaped the political, economic, and even psychological landscape of early medieval Europe for over 2 centuries. We're talking about an era where the very word Northmen or Danes could send shivers down the spine of even the most hardened warrior. These weren't just pirates. They were a cultural phenomenon, a military innovation, and a profound societal shockwave rolled into one. And their calling card, the raids. Now, to understand the brutal reality, we first need to strip away the modern veneer. Forget the horned helmets, a delightful 19th century operatic invention, utterly devoid of historical accuracy, unless you consider them a particularly inconvenient form of headwear in close-quarters combat. Forget the idea that they were some kind of monolithic, unified empire. They were, in fact, a diverse collection of chieftains, jarls, and kings from what we now call Scandinavia, modern-day Denmark, Norway, and Sweden, each with their own ambitions, rivalries, and preferred targets. What united them was a shared cultural heritage, a mastery of maritime technology, and a distinct lack of compunction when it came to separating people from their valuables, their homes, and occasionally their heads. So why did they start? Why, after centuries of relatively peaceful coexistence, did these Norse societies suddenly decide that the best way to interact with their European neighbors was by politely introducing them to the sharp end of an axe? Well, like most things in history, it wasn't a single, straightforward answer. It was a cocktail of factors, shaken vigorously and poured over a continent ripe for the picking. For starters, there was a degree of internal pressure. Scandinavia, while beautiful, isn't exactly a fertile paradise. Land was finite, especially good arable land. As populations grew, so did the competition for resources. Younger sons, ambitious chieftains, or those simply looking to make a name for themselves might find their opportunities limited at home. What do you do when your local economy is maxed out and the family farm isn't big enough for everyone? You look elsewhere. And elsewhere, in the late 8th century, was looking mighty appealing. Across the North Sea, Christian Europe was, by comparison, rather plump and complacent. The Frankish Empire under Charlemagne was vast but unwieldy. England was a patchwork of squabbling Anglo-Saxon kingdoms. Ireland was a collection of monastic settlements, bursting with gold and silver and, crucially, utterly undefended. Monasteries, you see, were the banks of the early medieval world. They accumulated wealth precious metals, jewels, ornate religious artifacts through donations, tithes, and their own industriousness. And they were, by and large, pacifist institutions, their inhabitants sworn to prayer, not to pike drills. They were, in essence, giant, glittering piggy banks just sitting there, waiting for someone with a boat and a strong arm to come along and smash them open. And speaking of boats, let's talk about the longship. This wasn't just a vessel, it was a technological marvel, a game changer. Imagine a ship that could traverse the open ocean, brave the fiercest storms, yet draw so little water that it could glide silently up shallow rivers, beach itself almost anywhere, and then be relaunched with minimal effort. These were not the cumbersome, deep-drafted merchant ships of the Romans or the Frankish navy. These were sleek, fast, shallow-drafted, clinker-built masterpieces of naval architecture, powered by both sail and oar. They were the stealth bombers of their age, allowing the Vikings to appear suddenly, strike with devastating speed, and then vanish back into the mist before any meaningful resistance could be mustered. This was not just a raid, it was a surgical strike, executed with terrifying efficiency. So you have ambitious young men, limited opportunities at home, incredible ship technology, and a continent full of rich, soft targets. It's not hard to see how the idea of going a Viking, which, by the way, was originally a verb, meaning to go on an overseas expedition, usually for plunder, became rather popular. It offered wealth, status, and the chance for glory. And in a society where personal honor and reputation were paramount, coming back with a boatload of loot and a few good scars wasn't just a financial transaction. It was a social promotion. Now let's get to the nitty-gritty, the moment that truly announced the arrival of this new, terrifying force on the European stage. The year was 793 AD. The location, Lindisfarne, a small, holy island off the coast of Northumbria in what is now northern England. This was no ordinary monastery. This was the spiritual heartland of Anglo-Saxon Christianity, the place where St. Cuthbert had lived, where the magnificent Lindisfarne Gospels were created. It was a beacon of learning, piety, and, unfortunately for its inhabitants, wealth. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, a contemporary historical record, describes it with chilling brevity. Here were dreadful forewarnings come over the land of Northumbria and woefully terrified the people. These were immense flashes of lightning, and fiery dragons were seen flying in the air. A great famine soon followed these signs, and not long after, in the same year, on the 8th of June, the ravages of heathen men miserably destroyed God's church on Lindisfarne with plunder and slaughter. Plunder and slaughter. It sounds so neat, doesn't it? So concise. But let's unpack that for a moment. Imagine you are a monk at Lindisfarne. Your life is one of prayer, study, quiet contemplation. You might hear tales of distant pagans, but they are abstract mythical figures. Then one morning you look out to sea and those fiery dragons, or perhaps just the sun glinting off the sails of unfamiliar ships, are suddenly very, very real. These aren't the familiar trading vessels. These are long, low, ominous shapes, bristling with men, and those men are not carrying sacks of grain. They are carrying axes, swords, and shields. The monks, being monks, were utterly unprepared. They had no fortifications, no standing army, no concept of organized defense. Their treasures, chalices, crosses, reliquaries, beautifully bound manuscripts were their pride, their connection to the divine. To the Vikings, they were simply gold, silver, and parchment, easily converted into coin or melted down. The slaughter wasn't a neat surgical strike. It was likely brutal, chaotic, and utterly terrifying. Monks were cut down where they stood, often in their own chapels. Others were dragged away bound to be sold into slavery, a fate often considered worse than death in a world where freedom was paramount. The altars were desecrated, the holy relics smashed, the libraries put to the torch. It was not just a robbery, it was an act of profound sacrilege, a deliberate assault on the very foundations of Christian belief, and it sent a shockwave across Europe. Suddenly, the Northmen weren't just a distant rumor. They were a terrifying, tangible threat, and they weren't just after a quick smash and grab. They were learning. Lindisfarne was just the appetizer. Over the next few decades, the raids became more frequent, more organized, and more ambitious. First, hit-and-run attacks on coastal monasteries and settlements. Then, they started venturing further inland, using those incredible longships to navigate rivers. They'd land, raid, and then melt away, leaving behind a trail of smoke, blood, and desolation. The psychological impact of these early raids cannot be overstated. Imagine living in a world where communication was slow, news traveled by foot or horseback, and your primary source of comfort was the local church. Then, out of nowhere, these fierce pagan warriors descend. They don't respect your saints, they don't care for your God, and they certainly don't adhere to any known rules of engagement. They are, in the eyes of their victims, quite literally, heathen devils. The very unpredictability of their attacks was a weapon in itself. You never knew where they would strike next. The sea, once a highway for trade and communication, became a terrifying conduit for destruction. As the 9th century progressed, the raids evolved. They were no longer just small bands of opportunistic raiders. They started forming larger fleets, sometimes hundreds of ships carrying thousands of warriors. They began to establish temporary bases, known as longforts in Ireland, or fortified camps, often on islands or strategic river bends, where they could overwinter and launch sustained campaigns. This marked a significant shift from seasonal piracy to organized military occupation. Take, for instance, the situation in Ireland. The island, fractured into numerous small kingdoms and dotted with wealthy monastic settlements, was an absolute goldmine for the Vikings. Dublin, for example, started life as a Viking longfort, a fortified ship encampment, before growing into a major Viking trading hub and eventually a city. The brutality here was relentless. Annals from the period are filled with accounts of churches plundered, towns burned, and vast numbers of captives taken. The Vikings didn't just kill, they enslaved. Slavery was a fundamental part of their economy. Captives, whether highborn monks or common peasants, were a valuable commodity to be traded in markets from Scandinavia to the Byzantine Empire. Imagine the horror of being dragged from your home, chained, and transported across the sea to a foreign land, to live out your days as property. This was the very real fate for countless thousands during the Viking Age. And then there was England. The Anglo-Saxon kingdoms, despite their internal squabbles, were relatively developed, but they were ill-equipped to deal with this new type of warfare. In 865 AD, something truly unprecedented arrived. The missile here, the Great Heathen Army. This wasn't a raiding party. This was a full-scale invasion force, a coordinated effort by multiple jarls, led by figures like Ivar the Boneless and Halfdan Ragnarsson. Their goal wasn't just plunder, it was conquest. They systematically moved through England, toppling kingdoms one by one. East Anglia, Northumbria, Mercia all fell to the Viking onslaught. They weren't just burning monasteries now. They were destroying entire political structures, installing puppet kings, and settling vast swathes of land. The brutality was on a new scale. When they captured York, for instance, they didn't just sack it. They turned it into a major Viking city, Jorvik, a center of their power. The Anglo-Saxon nobility and clergy faced a stark choice: flee, fight and die, or submit and pay tribute. And the tribute, known as Danegeld, was a crippling burden. It was protection money, paid to stop the violence, but it often just funded the next round of attacks. It was a protection racket on a national scale, and the Vikings were exceptionally good at it. The descriptions of their methods are chilling. They were masters of psychological warfare. They understood the power of terror. Stories abound of Viking warriors deliberately mutilating captives, sacrificing them to their gods, or using them as human shields. The sheer casualness of their violence, the apparent lack of remorse, must have been utterly bewildering to a Christian society that, while certainly no stranger to warfare, still operated under a different set of moral parameters. When you're facing an enemy who seems to delight in the destruction of everything you hold sacred, it's not just a physical battle, it's a spiritual one. And let's not forget the continent. The Frankish Empire, for all its might, was also a prime target. The The Vikings sailed up the great rivers, the Seine, the Loire, the Rhine, the Elbe, reaching deep into the heart of Europe. Paris itself was besieged multiple times. Imagine the capital of a great empire, surrounded by thousands of Viking warriors, its citizens huddled behind walls, watching as their surrounding countryside was put to the torch. In 845 AD, the Viking chieftain Reginhurus, possibly the legendary Ragnar Lodbrok, sailed up the Seine with a fleet of 120 ships and sacked Paris. Charlemagne's grandson, Charles the Bald, paid a staggering 7,000 pounds of silver to get them to leave, and they left only to come back a few years later, because, as it turns out, paying off a protection racket rarely makes it go away. It just confirms that you have money worth taking. The Vikings were not just raiders, they were also incredibly adaptable. They weren't just brute force, they were strategic. They exploited political weaknesses, leveraged their superior mobility, and learned from their experiences. They could switch from lightning raid to protracted siege, from a mercenary force fighting for a local king to a colonizing army establishing a new kingdom. They were, in essence, the ultimate entrepreneurial warriors. Now it's important to remember that the term Viking itself encompasses a vast spectrum of people and activities. Not everyone in Scandinavia was a raider. Many were farmers, traders, craftsmen, but it was the raiders who made the indelible mark, the ones who shaped the perception of the Norsemen for centuries to come. And the reason for that enduring perception is simple. They were utterly ruthless. They didn't just take, they destroyed. They didn't just kill, they terrorized. Consider the berserkers, for instance. The very word conjures images of wild, frenzied warriors, perhaps high on some hallucinogenic concoction, fighting in a trance-like state, impervious to pain. While the historical evidence for their exact nature is debated, were they a specific cult? Were they just particularly fierce warriors? The idea of them was a powerful psychological weapon. An enemy who seems utterly fearless, who charges into battle without armor, howling like a beast, is an enemy designed to break morale before the first blow is struck. Whether they truly existed as a distinct class of warrior or were merely a terrifying rumor spread by their victims, the effect was the same: fear. And the victims themselves, their stories are often lost to history, overshadowed by the dramatic narratives of battles and kings. But for the ordinary peasant, the monk, the merchant, the Viking Age was a time of profound insecurity. Imagine living with the constant threat of a sudden, violent death or worse, enslavement. Communities built up over generations could be wiped out in a single afternoon. Churches, the spiritual and often social centers of villages, could be reduced to smoking ruins. The very fabric of society was frayed, stretched thin by the relentless pressure. This wasn't just about economic devastation. It was about a deep existential dread. The Vikings didn't just steal your gold, they stole your peace of mind. They stole your sense of security. They forced entire populations to adapt, to build new defenses, to rethink their relationship with the sea, and to perhaps, just perhaps, reevaluate their faith in a god who seemed, at times, rather preoccupied elsewhere. Yet, amidst all this destruction, something else was happening. The Vikings, in their own peculiar way, were also agents of change, albeit often unintended. Their raids forced the fragmented kingdoms of Europe to coalesce, to develop stronger centralized authorities capable of mounting a defense. Alfred the Great in Wessex, for example, is often credited with laying the groundwork for a unified England precisely because he successfully resisted the great heathen army and established a system of fortified towns, or burhs, to defend against them. The constant threat led to innovation in military tactics, in fortification, and even in political organization. Furthermore, these raiders, these brutal heathens, also became traders and settlers. The very same longships that brought death and destruction also brought goods for exchange. Over time, many Viking raiding bands, particularly in areas like England, Ireland, and Normandy, transitioned from plunder to permanent settlement. They married into local populations, adopted new languages, and eventually even converted to Christianity. The very people who had terrorized Europe for generations eventually became part of its fabric, contributing to its culture, its language, and its genetic makeup. The irony, of course, is that the descendants of these brutal raiders would go on to become some of the most powerful and influential figures in European history, from the Norman conquerors of England to the founders of the Rus states in Eastern Europe. We'll continue this rather grim tour of Viking tourism, if you will, because the story of the Viking Age isn't just a series of isolated smash and grabs. It's a grand, bloody opera of adaptation, resistance, and eventual integration. And if you thought the initial shock of Lindisfarne was the climax, well, you haven't been paying attention. That was merely the overture, a discordant, axe-driven symphony announcing the main act. The immediate reaction to these incursions across Europe was, predictably, a mix of sheer panic and bewildered helplessness. Imagine being a local lord, perhaps more accustomed to squabbling with your neighbors over a disputed pasture, suddenly confronted with a highly mobile, exceptionally violent, and utterly alien force. Your local militia, a collection of farmers with rusty tools and even rustier morale, was simply no match for hardened warriors who had literally sailed across oceans for the express purpose of relieving you of your worldly possessions, and your life, probably your life. The Frankish Empire, for all its pretensions of grandeur under Charlemagne's successors, was particularly vulnerable. It was vast, yes, but also increasingly fragmented, a sprawling buffet of internal rivalries and weak leadership. The Vikings, ever the opportunists, saw this not as a problem, but as a target-rich environment. They didn't just hit the coast, they sailed deep inland, up the major rivers like the Seine, the Loire, and the Rhine, turning what were once vital arteries of trade into highways of plunder. Consider the repeated sieges of Paris. Yes, that Paris. The city that would one day be known for its romantic allure and its exquisite pastries was, for decades, a prime target for Norse aggression. In 845 AD, as we briefly mentioned, Ragnar Lodbrok, or at least a chieftain named Reginhorus who might have inspired the legend, sailed up the Seine with a truly impressive fleet. The Franks, utterly unprepared, offered minimal resistance. Paris was sacked, the terms of their departure. A colossal payment of 7,000 pounds of silver. A king, Charles the Bald, essentially paid protection money to a bunch of pagan raiders. And if you think that was a one-off, a moment of weakness, bless your optimistic heart, the Vikings came back, and back again. In 885–886 AD, Paris endured a year-long siege, a truly epic struggle where the city's defenders, led by Count Odo and Bishop Goslin, held out against a massive Viking army. It was a brutal, drawn-out affair, a testament to both Viking persistence and Frankish desperation. The city only truly survived because the Emperor Charles the Fat, not exactly a ringing endorsement of leadership, that name, eventually arrived with a relief army, only to also pay the Vikings to leave and let them pillage Burgundy instead. Because clearly, some parts of the empire were more expendable than others. It's a classic example of short-term appeasement leading to long-term headaches. This Danegeld system, as it became known in England, was a double-edged sword. On one hand, it occasionally bought temporary respite. On the other, it essentially acted as a venture capital fund for the next wave of raids. It proved to the Vikings that the Europeans had vast quantities of wealth, and that they were, shall we say, reluctant to fight for it. Why bother with the messy business of a full-scale battle when you could simply demand a king's ransom and sail away with it? It was, from the Viking perspective, an incredibly efficient business model. But not all of Europe rolled over. In England, one figure stands out, Alfred the Great. Now, Alfred initially had a rather rough time of it. He spent a good deal of his early reign running for his life, hiding in the fens of Athelney, famously burning some cakes while contemplating the utter collapse of his kingdom. But Alfred was no ordinary king. He learned, he adapted, and he decided that paying the Vikings off was a fool's errand. Alfred's genius lay not just in his military prowess, though he certainly had that. culminating in his decisive victory at Edington in 878 AD. His real brilliance was in his strategic vision. He understood that the Anglo-Saxon kingdoms were vulnerable because they lacked a coherent defensive system. So he embarked on an ambitious program of reform. He reorganized his army, ensuring that a portion of the Field, the local militia, was always available for service, rather than just being called up for short periods. But most importantly, he built burhs. A burh was a fortified settlement, a stronghold. These weren't just random walls, they were strategically placed, often on old Roman sites or natural defensive positions, forming a network across Wessex. They were designed not just as places of refuge, but as offensive bases, from which Alfred's forces could sally forth and intercept Viking raiding parties. Each burh had a permanent garrison and was responsible for defending a surrounding area. This was a revolutionary concept for the time, a shift from reactive defense to proactive deterrence. It wasn't cheap and it wasn't easy, but it worked. The burhs starved the Vikings of easy targets, forced them to engage in costly sieges, and ultimately made England a far less attractive proposition for casual plunder. Alfred didn't just defeat the Vikings, he changed the rules of the game. He forced them to transition from hit-and-run raids to full-scale, difficult conquests, and even then he was prepared. The establishment of the Danelaw in England was a direct consequence of this shift. After Edington, Alfred negotiated a treaty with the Viking leader Guthrum, effectively dividing England. The Vikings, having exhausted themselves with raiding and finding it increasingly difficult to plunder the fortified south, settled in the east and north. This wasn't a defeat for Alfred, it was a strategic stalemate. It meant that a significant portion of England was now under Viking rule, yes, but it also meant that the core Anglo-Saxon kingdom of Wessex was secure, and the constant, debilitating raids had largely ceased. The Vikings, for their part, became farmers, traders, and eventually, Christianized subjects. The brutal reality of the raid gave way to the complex reality of coexistence, albeit one often punctuated by further conflict. Let's delve a bit more into the sheer scale of the terror. Imagine the monasteries, those bastions of learning and piety. They were, as mentioned, effectively the banks of the age, accumulating wealth through donations, tithes, and their own industrious labor. They were also, crucially, undefended. The monks, dedicated to prayer and scholarship, were not exactly trained warriors. So when a longship landed, disgorging a dozen or more axe-wielding pagans, the outcome was rarely in doubt. The accounts are horrific. Monks were slaughtered at the altar, their holy relics desecrated, their libraries put to the torch. Not just for wanton destruction, mind you, but because the bindings of books contained precious metals, and the parchment could be scraped clean and reused for secular purposes. The chalices, crosses, and reliquaries, objects of immense spiritual significance to the Christian world, were simply melted down for their silver and gold. This wasn't just robbery, it was an assault on the very soul of Christian Europe. The psychological impact of seeing your most sacred objects defiled, your spiritual leaders butchered, was profound. It led to desperate prayers, to the famous litany, a furore normanorum libera nos, Domine, from the fury of the Northmen, deliver us, O Lord. It was a plea born of utter despair. But the Vikings weren't just interested in gold and silver. They were also after people. Slavery was a fundamental component of the Viking economy. Captured men, women, and children were a valuable commodity. Imagine the terror of being dragged from your home, perhaps seeing your family murdered, then being bound, chained, and crammed onto a longship, destined for a slave market in Dublin, Scandinavia, or even further afield to the markets of the Rus in Eastern Europe or the Byzantine Empire. Your entire life, your identity, reduced to mere property. This was the fate of countless thousands. The Irish annals, in particular, are replete with mentions of vast numbers of captives taken, sometimes entire communities. These weren't just tales, they were lived realities. The methods of Viking warfare, while appearing chaotic to their victims, were actually quite effective. Their primary weapon was often the axe, a simple but devastating tool in the hands of a strong warrior. The Danish axe, in particular, with its long handle and broad head, could cleave through shields and armor with terrifying force. Swords were also common, often beautifully crafted, but the axe was the iconic weapon of the Viking raider. Spears were used for thrusting and throwing, and bows were employed for skirmishing. Their primary defensive formation was the shield wall, a tightly packed formation of warriors with interlocking shields, presenting a formidable barrier to an enemy charge. This was not a unique invention. Many ancient and medieval armies used similar formations, but the Vikings were masters of it. They would advance slowly, relentlessly, their shields protecting them from missiles, then break into a charge, using their axes and swords in close-quarters combat. The berserkers, if they existed as a distinct class, would have been at the forefront of such a charge, their supposed imperviousness to pain, and their frenzied attacks designed to break the enemy line and sow panic. Whether fueled by mushrooms, alcohol, or simply sheer adrenaline, and a terrifying disregard for their own safety, the psychological effect of facing such a warrior must have been utterly paralyzing. Naval tactics were also crucial. Their longships were not just transport vessels. They could be used in battle, allowing for rapid deployment, flanking maneuvers, and even acting as floating fortresses. They could land troops quickly, then re-embark just as fast, making them incredibly difficult to pin down. This mobility was their greatest asset, allowing them to choose the time and place of engagement, often catching their enemies completely by surprise. The impact of these raids wasn't just felt in the West. The Swedish Vikings, often referred to as the Rus, ventured east down the great rivers of Eastern Europe, the Volga, the Dnieper, establishing trade routes that stretched all the way to Byzantium and the Abbasid Caliphate. But their journey was not without its own brand of brutality. They established fortified trading posts, but also engaged in raids on the local Slavic and Finnic tribes, extracting tribute, capturing slaves, and generally making their presence known with a combination of commercial acumen and casual violence. They founded the early Rus states, giving their name to Russia itself, but not before engaging in countless brutal encounters with the indigenous populations. The accounts of Arab travelers who encountered them often speak of their immense strength, their lack of hygiene, and their disturbing penchant for human sacrifice. Not exactly the sort of chaps you'd invite to a dinner party. So for nearly 3 centuries, Europe lived under the shadow of the longship. The constant threat of raids led to profound societal changes. Fortification became paramount. Towns and cities that had once been open and undefended began to build walls and towers. Local lords, tired of seeing their lands ravaged, began to consolidate power, creating larger, more centralized kingdoms capable of mounting effective resistance. The feudal system, with its emphasis on local defense and military service, arguably received a significant boost from the need to counter the Viking threat. You couldn't rely on a distant king to save you when a fleet of longships was sailing up your river. You needed local protection, and that meant a stronger local lord with armed retainers. The church, too, adapted. While initially helpless, it began to preach the concept of a just war against the pagans. Monasteries, previously undefended, either moved to more secure locations or began to build their own fortifications. Some bishops even led their own militias into battle, a rather unmonastic but entirely pragmatic response to the existential threat. The very concept of Christendom as a unified entity, despite its internal divisions, was strengthened by the shared external enemy. But the Viking Age didn't last forever. By the late 10th and early 11th centuries, the nature of Viking activity began to change. Why? Several factors contributed to the decline of the traditional, brutal raid. Firstly, Europe got tougher. Those burhs and fortifications, those reorganized armies, those unified kingdoms, they made raiding far less profitable and far more dangerous. The easy pickings were gone. A single longship full of warriors was no longer enough to terrorize a region. You needed a full-scale army, and those were expensive and difficult to organize. Secondly, the Scandinavian homelands themselves were undergoing a transformation. Powerful kings began to emerge in Denmark, Norway, and Sweden, consolidating power and curbing the independence of the petty jarls, who had once led the smaller raiding parties. These kings often found it more advantageous to control trade and collect taxes than to send their subjects off on risky plundering expeditions. They also began to embrace Christianity, which, while initially adopted for political expediency, gradually led to a shift in cultural values. A Christian king was less likely to sanction the brutal pagan raids that had defined the previous centuries. Thirdly, the economic landscape shifted. The wealth of Europe, while still tempting, was increasingly tied up in fortified towns and centralized treasuries, rather than scattered in vulnerable monasteries. Trade, ironically, became a more reliable source of income than plunder. Many former Viking strongholds, like Dublin and Jorvik, evolved from raiding bases into bustling commercial centers, where goods were exchanged rather than stolen. Finally, the Vikings themselves, or their descendants, became part of the European fabric. In England, the Danelaw eventually became part of a unified English kingdom. In Normandy, the Viking settlers, led by Rollo, were granted land in exchange for defending the Frankish coast from other Vikings. They rapidly adopted French language, customs, and Christianity, becoming the Normans, a group who would, ironically, conquer England in 1066, bringing a new wave of brutality, but this time with a distinctly French accent and a penchant for building castles rather than burning monasteries. The Rus states in the east solidified into the powerful Kievan Rus, laying the foundations for modern Russia and Ukraine. The initial brutal reality of the raid had, over time, morphed into the complex reality of settlement, integration, and the forging of new identities. But let's not get ahead of ourselves with the neat historical conclusions. The memory of the brutal reality lingered for centuries. The sagas, while romanticized, still recount tales of fierce battles, cunning strategies, and unflinching violence. The archaeological record continues to unearth the grim evidence: mass graves, burned settlements, hordes of plundered treasure. The very language of Europe still bears the scars, with words like ransack, berserk, and anger having Norse origins, a linguistic echo of a time when the Northmen brought a particular brand of fury to the continent. Because the echoes of those longships, those axes, and those desperate prayers reverberated through the very soul of Europe for generations. It wasn't just about the physical destruction, the melted gold, or the shattered bones. It was about the profound psychological scar left by an enemy who seemed to defy all known conventions of warfare and morality. Imagine for a moment not being the victim of a raid, but simply living in a village a few miles inland, listening to the terrified whispers and distorted rumors that filtered in from the coast. The news of a Viking attack didn't arrive via Twitter or the evening news. It arrived on the pale, shaking lips of a refugee, a survivor who had witnessed unspeakable horrors. The stories would grow in the telling, becoming almost mythical in their terror. Fiery dragons in the sky, men who could not be killed, warriors who reveled in the screams of their victims. This wasn't just propaganda. It was the raw, visceral fear of the unknown, of the utterly alien. The very landscape became imbued with this dread. Rivers, once pathways for commerce and communication, became conduits for death. Coastal communities, once vibrant and outward-looking, turned inward, building watchtowers and rudimentary defenses, or simply abandoning their homes for the relative safety of the interior. The sea, the very source of life and trade for so many, became a symbol of impending doom, a vast, gray expanse from which terror could emerge at any moment. This constant, low-level anxiety, punctuated by moments of extreme, bloody panic, shaped the medieval mind in ways we can barely comprehend today. It reinforced a worldview where the world was a dangerous place, where God's favor was fleeting, and where the forces of evil were very real and very tangible. The litany, a Furore Normanorum Libera Nos, Domine, wasn't just a prayer. It was a desperate plea from the heart of a terrified continent. It was a recognition that this was a foe beyond the ordinary, a force of nature as much as a military threat. And the Vikings, being rather astute observers of human nature, understood the power of this fear. They didn't just raid, they terrorized. They didn't just kill, they often inflicted deliberate, ritualistic violence designed to maximize psychological impact. Accounts, though often from biased Christian sources, speak of human sacrifices, of victims being subjected to the blood eagle, a gruesome ritual where the victim's back was cut open, their ribs severed from the spine, and their lungs pulled out to resemble wings. While the historical veracity of the blood eagle is still debated among scholars, some see it as a literary invention, others as a rare but horrific practice. The belief in such atrocities was enough to strike profound terror into the hearts of their enemies. It painted the Vikings not just as warriors, but as demonic figures beyond the pale of Christian morality. This wasn't just about taking wealth, it was about crushing the spirit. When a monastery, a symbol of divine protection and human piety, was utterly annihilated, it wasn't just a financial loss, it was a crisis of faith. If God's own chosen servants in God's own house could be so brutally massacred, what hope was there for the common peasant? This profound spiritual shock contributed to a sense of apocalyptic dread that permeated the early medieval period. Yet, as we touched upon, humans are remarkably adaptable creatures, even in the face of existential dread. The initial panic eventually gave way to more organized resistance, to strategic thinking, and to the slow, painful process of adaptation. We've discussed Alfred the Great's Spurs, a stroke of defensive genius. But across Europe, similar, albeit less coordinated, efforts were being made. Local lords who once saw their neighbors as primary rivals began to forge alliances against the common enemy. Fortifications, rudimentary at first, became more sophisticated. Churches and monasteries, realizing that prayer alone was insufficient, either moved their most valuable treasures to safer, inland locations or invested in their own defenses, sometimes even hiring armed guards, a rather unholy but entirely practical measure. The very structure of society began to reorient itself around defense. The nature of Viking activity also evolved. As the easy pickings became scarcer and resistance grew stronger, the Vikings themselves faced a choice: continue the increasingly dangerous and less profitable hit-and-run raids, or transition to something more sustainable. Many chose the latter. This led to the fascinating, often brutal process of settlement. Take, for instance, the story of Rollo in Normandy. This was not a simple, peaceful integration. Rollo was a formidable Viking chieftain who had led numerous raids up the Seine, terrorizing the Frankish kingdom. In 911 AD, the Frankish king Charles the Simple, exasperated and desperate to end the constant depredations, made a pragmatic decision. He offered Rollo a swathe of land in what is now northern France, on the condition that Rollo and his followers would cease their raiding and, crucially, defend the mouth of the Seine from other Vikings. It was a classic set a thief to catch a thief strategy. Rollo accepted. He and his Norse followers settled the land, which became known as Normandy, Land of the Northmen. They rapidly adopted the local language Old French, converted to Christianity, and embraced Frankish customs, including the feudal system. Within a few generations, these descendants of fierce pagan raiders were indistinguishable from the local Frankish nobility, save for their exceptional martial prowess and their rather aggressive ambition. The brutal raiders had become the formidable Norman knights, who would go on to conquer England, southern Italy, and Sicily, and even lead crusades. The irony is delicious. the very force that almost broke Europe ended up becoming one of its most dynamic and expansionist components. The seed of their initial brutality, their ruthless efficiency, was simply redirected and repackaged. A similar, though distinct, transformation occurred in the East. The Swedish Vikings, the Rus, who had initially plundered their way down the rivers of Eastern Europe, soon realized the immense wealth to be gained from trade. They established a vast network connecting the Baltic to Byzantium and the Islamic Caliphate, exchanging furs, slaves, yes, still slaves, a constant thread in this narrative, honey and wax for silks, spices, and silver. They founded powerful trading centers like Novgorod and Kiev, laying the foundations for the Kievan Rus, the precursor to modern Russia and Ukraine. Their initial brutal imposition of tribute and control over the Slavic tribes gradually evolved into a more formalized system of governance. Here, too, the transition from raider to ruler was often marked by violence, but it was a violence of state building, not just opportunistic plunder. The very name Rus is thought to derive from an Old Norse word for the men who row, a direct linguistic link back to those fearsome longships. The human cost of this era, both during the raids and the subsequent periods of settlement and conquest, is almost impossible to quantify. Beyond the direct casualties of battle and the countless enslaved, there was the less visible toll, the destruction of economic life, the disruption of agricultural cycles, the famine and disease that often followed in the wake of destruction. Entire regions were depopulated, their cultural heritage erased or profoundly altered. The demographic landscape of parts of Europe was literally reshaped by the influx of Norse settlers, leading to new genetic mixes and cultural fusions that are still evident today. And what of the women and children? They were not immune to the brutal reality. Women were taken as captives, sold into slavery, or forced into marriage. Children faced similar fates, their lives irrevocably altered by the arrival of the Northmen. Yet paradoxically, women also played a crucial role in the settlement process. They were often the bridge between cultures, marrying into local communities and raising children who were a blend of both Norse and native traditions. The blending of bloodlines, languages, and customs was a slow, complex, and often fraught process, but it was fundamental to the eventual integration of the Vikings into the European mainstream. The very definition of Viking began to blur, becoming less about an ethnicity and more about a shared cultural heritage of maritime prowess and martial ambition. The Viking Age, therefore, was not just a period of destruction. It was a period of profound transformation. The brutal reality of the raids forced Europe to grow up, to consolidate, to develop new forms of defense and governance. It inadvertently accelerated the process of state building and the development of feudalism. It led to the spread of new technologies and ideas, even if those ideas sometimes arrived at the point of a sword. The legacy of the Viking raids is complex and contradictory. On one hand, it's a story of unbridled savagery, of pagan fury unleashed on a Christian world, leaving behind a trail of blood, fire, and despair. It's a reminder that history is not always polite, and that human capacity for violence is profound. On the other hand, it's also a story of resilience, of adaptation, and of the incredible human ability to absorb, integrate, and transform even the most disruptive forces. The very people who once terrorized Europe eventually became its kings, its nobles, its traders, and its farmers, leaving behind not just ruins, but also vibrant cities, new legal systems, and a rich tapestry of cultural exchange. The Viking Age ended not with a bang, but with a whimper, or perhaps more accurately, a gradual absorption. The last major Viking invasion of England, led by Harold Hardrada in 1066, ended in his defeat at the Battle of Stamford Bridge, just weeks before the Norman conquest. By then, the nature of warfare had changed, the political landscape had solidified, and the Viking, as a distinct external threat, was largely a thing of the past. The descendants of those brutal raiders were now fighting each other, or fighting for European kings, or simply living out their lives as settled farmers and merchants. The longship, once a symbol of terror, became a symbol of trade, exploration, and cultural connection. We've seen how Europe, initially a plump, unsuspecting target, slowly but surely began to develop antibodies to this particular brand of Nordic fever. The scattered, squabbling kingdoms began, out of sheer necessity, to coalesce. The Frankish Empire, for all its internal squabbles, eventually found its footing, even if it meant paying off the occasional raiding party. England, under the guidance of figures like Alfred the Great, transformed from a patchwork of vulnerable kingdoms into a more unified, defensively minded entity, complete with its strategic boroughs and reorganized armies. The monastic communities, having learned their lesson, either moved their treasures or fortified their walls, making the easy pickings of yore a thing of the past. It turns out, when you consistently make yourself a difficult and unprofitable target, even the most determined raider eventually looks for easier prospects. It's basic economics, really, even if the currency is gold, silver, and human lives. The very success of the raids, in a strange twist of historical irony, contributed to their eventual decline as a dominant force. As the Vikings accumulated vast wealth, as they established permanent bases like Dublin and Jorvik, as they ventured further afield and encountered more sophisticated societies, their own ambitions shifted. Why risk life and limb on a precarious raid when you could establish a lucrative trade route? Why plunder a monastery when you could tax an entire region? The allure of a quick smash and grab gave way to the more sustainable, if still often violent, business of settlement and state building. The transition was, of course, far from peaceful. The Viking settlements in England, Ireland, and Normandy were not established through polite negotiations and land deeds. They were carved out through conquest, through the subjugation of local populations, and through the continued use of force. But once established, these settlements began to take on a life of their own. The raiders became rulers. The pagan warriors became Christian kings. The foreign invaders became, over time, the new natives, their identities blurring and merging with the very people they had once terrorized. Consider the Danelaw in England. For decades, it was a land of stark cultural and legal division, but over time the lines softened. Intermarriage was common. Norse words entered the English language, enriching its vocabulary with terms like sky, leg, anger, and husband. The very legal systems began to influence each other. It was a slow, often painful process of assimilation, but it was assimilation nonetheless. The descendants of those who once burned churches were now building them, albeit often with a slightly more robust design. And what of the Scandinavian homelands themselves? They were not immune to this transformation. The petty chieftains and independent jarls who had once launched their raiding fleets from isolated fjords gradually found themselves under the authority of powerful, centralized kings. Figures like Harald Fairhair in Norway, Gorm the Old in Denmark, and Eric the Victorious in Sweden began to consolidate power, bringing an end to the internal feuds that had often driven young men to seek their fortunes abroad. These emerging kingdoms, often Christianized through a mix of missionary zeal and political expediency, had less incentive to sanction widespread pagan raiding. They were more interested in controlling trade, collecting taxes, and establishing stable realms. The energy that once fueled overseas plunder was increasingly directed inwards, towards internal consolidation, and eventually, towards more conventional forms of warfare and diplomacy. The very term Viking Age itself, while useful, often obscures this crucial transition. It implies a static period of constant raiding, when in reality it was a dynamic era of profound change, where the brutal reality of the raid was just one phase, albeit a very impactful one. The Norse people continued to be formidable seafarers, explorers, and warriors, but the nature of their interactions with the wider world evolved. They discovered and briefly settled North America, established trade routes to the Middle East, served as elite mercenaries for the Byzantine Emperor, and founded powerful dynasties across Europe. But these later exploits, while still requiring immense courage and often involving violence, were part of a different narrative than the initial, unprovoked, purely predatory raids. The last major Viking invasion of England, Harald Hardrada's attempt in 1066, is often seen as the symbolic end of the Viking Age proper. He was a formidable warrior king, a true heir to the Viking tradition, but his defeat at Stamford Bridge marked a turning point. The world had moved on. The Anglo-Saxon kingdom, though soon to fall to the Normans, themselves descendants of Vikings, remember, was a far more organized and resilient opponent than the fractured kingdoms of the 9th century. The era of easy plunder, of appearing out of the mist and simply taking what you wanted, was definitively over. The brutal reality of Viking raids, then, was not a static horror show. It was a dynamic force that reshaped societies, accelerated political evolution, and left an indelible mark on the cultural and genetic landscape of Europe. It forced kings to become strategists, peasants to become defenders, and entire populations to reconsider their place in a dangerous world. It was a period of immense suffering and destruction, yes, but also a crucible in which new nations were forged, new defenses innovated, and new identities, often a curious blend of conqueror and conquered, began to emerge. From the ashes of burned monasteries rose fortified towns. From the chaos of decentralized kingdoms emerged more unified states. The very people who brought the fury of the Northmen eventually brought new trade routes, new legal customs, and even new words that still pepper our language today. The longship, once a harbinger of death, ultimately became a symbol of exploration and connection, leading to discoveries that span continents. So when you next encounter the sanitized, romanticized version of the Vikings, perhaps in a historical drama where everyone is impossibly clean and morally conflicted, or at a festival where the biggest threat is a poorly aimed foam axe, take a moment. Remember the true, brutal reality. Remember the chilling accounts from the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, the desperate prayers of the monks, the sheer terror of ordinary people facing an utterly ruthless and alien force. Remember that history, particularly the history of power and conquest, is rarely pretty. It's often messy, violent, and utterly unforgiving. But also remember that from that brutality, something new always arises. The Viking Age, for all its horrors, was a testament to the enduring resilience of humanity, to its capacity to adapt, to resist, and ultimately, to absorb and transform even the most destructive forces. It was a period of profound change, a violent turning point that set Europe on a new trajectory. And the echoes of those longships, those axes, and those desperate prayers still resonate, if you listen closely enough, here in the quiet, late hours on Beyond Midnight. Thank you for joining us on this journey into the shadows of history. Until next time, keep questioning, keep exploring, and try not to let the ghosts of the past keep you up too late. Good night.